Hello, beautiful people, and welcome! Hi! To a quick little yap video about the leaked Electro-Charged character. But yeah, so we've had leaks that there's gonna be a character that's supposed to work somewhat like Nilou to buff Electro-Charged. And apparently that character will not have the team restriction that Nilou has. And I wanted to take a minute to talk about the potential outcomes from something like that. So first things first, we gotta understand what they mean by like Nilou. So how the heck does Nilou work? Well, Nilou buffs Bloom. But how does she buff Bloom? Well, she doesn't change anything about the way that the reaction gets triggered, but she does change the effect of triggering that reaction. The way I see it, there's three potential options for that upcoming Electro-Charged character. Option number one, they don't actually work like Nilou and they work like Chevalars, where it doesn't change anything about the reactions mechanics whatsoever, it just makes the number bigger. Or it works like Nilou's damage buff to Bloom damage, but it doesn't have the change in base mechanics of the Blooms not being hyper bloomable and exploding instantly. That's option number one. Outright just a numbers change. Option number two is that it works pretty much exactly like Nilou, where it doesn't change anything about the way the reaction gets triggered, but adds additional effects to what happens when you trigger it. Right now, if you trigger Electro-Charged on an enemy and there's a nearby enemy that's also affected by Hydro, they will take damage without losing aura. They could make it so that Electro-Charge with that character becomes an actual chain reaction where the more enemies applied with Hydro, the more your lightning starts bouncing around, a bit like Beto's burst bounces around. And option number three is changing the way the actual base reaction works. And honestly, I think that is possible. Electro-Charge is a pretty unique reaction in that instead of having an element as the aura, and when you apply a different element, it triggers a reaction and reduces the aura by however much element you applied. Electro and Hydro don't actually oppose one another when you apply them on an enemy. You apply Hydro, you apply Electro, both end up as aura on the enemy. And then they tick down, and it does an instance of Electro-Charge damage, and it eats both the Hydro and the Electro aura. And it keeps doing that until one of the two is gone. A good way to properly notice that is to use elemental applications that are more than 1U. So let's use Child because his tap skill is 2U Hydro, and Beto because her skill is 2U and her burst is 4U. If I just apply 1U Hydro, alright, I'll get one Electro-Charge, a second instance of Electro-Charge, and then because I have a lot of Electro but not a lot of Hydro, you can see my Electro aura stayed on the enemy for a while. When you use stronger auras, like 4U Hydro into 2U, or 4U Electro into 2U Hydro, you can see we got, what was that, 4 instances of Electro-Charge damage? And it stayed for longer. Here we still had some leftover Electro because 4 is bigger than 2. If we were to use 2 and 2, you'll end up with no leftovers, or barely any leftovers. Right? Here there was a tiny little bit of leftover Hydro because we applied the Hydro later. When you've got Electro-Charged, they basically just both tick down until one of them is gone. But whenever you apply a new element, whenever you reapply Electro or reapply Hydro, it changes the ownership of the Electro-Charge. So in order to show that properly, let's give our Lisa a lot of EM. When Child triggers Electro-Charge, the Electro-Charge hits are 2400. When Milani triggers it, 1700. And when Lisa triggers it, 6000. So what happens if I get Electro-Charge going, right, with this setup that has, what, 4 ticks of Electro-Charge here, and I add in this. From the fact that I applied Electro while Electro-Charge was going with Lisa, my ownership of Electro-Charge changed from Child to Lisa. The thing is, if you've got slow application, you won't get good Electro-Charge uptime. But if you have fast application, your Electro-Charge is going to have its ownership split between both of your elements, which leads to an interesting situation. What the hell are you gonna do with the default way Electro-Charge works to make a reaction-focused team? Well, you've got a few options. Build everyone EM, build no one EM, or pray. basically. That's why I think that there's a very real possibility that the character actually changes the way the reaction's like base aura works and changes it into a reaction that has a trigger and an aura. It's also possible that the reaction buff is something that is pretty big by itself, but doesn't really care about the rest of your team building EM. If you've looked into Nilou TC at all, you'll know that there's a lot of situations where you don't actually build that much EM on your other characters because they still get reasonable bloom damage from Nilou's passive, and building them for talent damage is better than building them for additional bloom damage. And I could see that being the case for those new Electro-Charged teams. It's very possible that they make it so that the Electro-Charged buff is pretty big to the whole team, but doesn't care that much about your EM. In the case of Nilou teams specifically, you still consider building your triggers full EM because they get pretty good ownership of the reaction, right? Usually, let's say you're playing Nilou, Nahida, Xingqiu, Kave or some shit like that. You build Nahida full EM because that's the stat her damage scales with anyways. You build Nilou full HP because that's kind of what she has to be built on. You build Kave full EM because you need to, otherwise he's not gonna heal for shit and you're gonna die. And then your last unit, looking at the way your auras work, whether you're using Xingqiu or a different unit, maybe you're using something like Kogami, something like Yilan, maybe even Farina. You can consider building them EM because with the base application you have a lot of Dendro application, which means your Hydro unit is going to have really high ownership of blooms. But like I said, in Electro-Charged teams, that's not really going to happen. No one unit is going to have the majority of ownership of Electro-Charged. Anyways, all of this to say, I do think there's a very real possibility that those Electro-Charged teams have good damage coming from Electro-Charged, but you still build your characters the same way you build them without Electro-Charged. You still build them on the build you would currently do. And then the question becomes, what else does that character do? Do they just increase Electro-Charge damage? Do they have good electro application themselves? Do they have a team buff? I mean, Nilou buffs the team by 100 EM. Maybe that Electro-Charge character gives 20% attack or something. And then when you start looking at all of those, once we have more information, we'll be able to get a better idea for how you're going to want to build your teams. What sort of teams do I expect to work? Well, obviously, like I said, it's going to depend on specific way that the reaction buff works. Obviously, you're gonna have default taser teams, like 100%. No matter what, taser teams are gonna be played, for sure. What else? Probably Neuvillette, right? People already play Auron in Neuvillette teams, and unless that character is just complete dog shit, they will probably be an Auron upgrade in those teams. Maybe that character themselves doesn't have electro buffing or electro application. I'm assuming it's gonna be an electro character. Maybe it'll be a hydro one, or maybe they're gonna work kind of like Mika in that they don't really apply their own element at all. They might work in Versa teams, the ones that use Farina Canyon. Right now your last slot is the Ansan, but if you get more value from that Electro-Charge buff, then maybe that'll be what people do. Might make some Climb teams better, but also Hyper Bloom. Neat thing about Hyper Bloom is that, as it turns out, it has Hydro and Electro. The biggest thing though here is that you don't actually get that many Electro-Charge procs when you play Hyper Bloom. You will get a few, but your Dendro aura prevents you from triggering Electro-Charge. So the faster your Dendro aura is, the less Electro-Charges you'll get. But the faster your Dendro is, the more Hyper Blooms you'll get. And so what I could see is that character potentially reducing the gap between Nahida and other Dendros in Hyper Bloom teams by making it so that slower Dendros get something in exchange for what they're losing out on Hyper Bloom. But I don't really expect it to buff the stronger Hyper Bloom teams. Another potential thing is, right now, there's very little reason to play on-fielders that are not Nahida in Hyper Bloom teams, or at least not Dendro. There's a bit of a reason to play Hytham. That's because having your on-fielder be an Electro unit means that your on-fielder will be the trigger, but that means they're getting a lot of Hyper Blooms, but if you build them full EM, their talent damage doesn't do that much, and if their talent damage doesn't do that much, they're barely doing more damage than off-fielders like Raiden. And that's the biggest thing that characters like Sino have going against them. But maybe that new Electro-Charge character actually gives us proper reason to on-field these Hydro or Electro characters with maybe a bit slower dendro application from off-field. Maybe you use Baiju as your main dendro, right? Maybe something like this plus that new character with an on-field. And like I said, we don't know if they're Hydro or Electro yet. If they're Electro, maybe an on-field Hydro. If they're Hydro, maybe an on-field Electro. That sort of stuff might also see some play. Oh yeah, also I haven't mentioned Chaska. That's true. Chaska could also end up getting some good taser teams. All in all, I'm excited. I think that if it is not a character like Chevreuse, if it doesn't just reduce electro resistance, it could be pretty cool. If you've watched me for a while, you'll know that I was not very happy with Nilou's design, but the main thing I didn't like about Nilou was the team restriction. The fact that Nilou was a character that actually warps a reaction and makes it function differently, I thought was great. What pissed me off was that really cool and interesting mechanic was locked behind a team building restriction that prevented you from playing characters you liked. But from what we know so far, this upcoming character doesn't have a similar restriction, and so I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the kid is gonna be, and I hope you are too. So as usual, I hope you learned a thing or two about dank Electro-Charged stuff. Do all the good old YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.